Well, first of all, I'm Suzanne Smith, professor of mechanical and aerospace engineering at the University of Kentucky, where we have been doing balloon launches in one form or another since about 2002, so about 20 years. And there are many, many things that can go wrong on a launch day, from that experience, I can assure you. I think our approach to thinking about this, particularly when we have a new project, is to think about contingency planning the way that NASA Systems Engineering Handbook and NASA processes recommend. And they're always talking about what can go wrong. And you can make a huge list of what can go wrong and then look at each item of what can go wrong in terms of how likely it is and then what's the consequence of it. And if the consequence isn't very high, then maybe you don't have to spend so much time on it. But if the consequence is huge, like the whole mission gets messed up, then you should definitely figure out ways to mitigate if that goes wrong. So what can go wrong? If you look at the whole balloon string, there's the balloon, its attachment to the string, and all the different payloads on the string. And I'll tell you that on launch days, we've had balloons get holes in them. And so they've had slow leaks. And this could be from handling during the fill, or it could be something that's just inherent in the manufacturing. And when it gets filled to a certain point, it just starts to leak. So you could have something like that happen. We've had balloons become detached from the string. And so the balloon flew away and the string didn't go with it. And that's actually happened more than once, and that happened the day of the last eclipse. And so the students were ready for that because it had happened in one of their rehearsals. They had a second balloon ready to go. They had already practiced, getting it out there, getting it filled, and got it off the ground in a short amount of time so they could still meet the timing of the eclipse the last time. We've had knots go bad on different aspects of attaching payloads to the string. And we always try to get people that are good and practiced with knots to, practice first of all, and then second of all, be the ones who, if they're not the ones actually doing the tying, they check the knots that have been made and the tying, and we kind of have a process to go down the string and check everything before it's launched. And that's another way of mitigating something that could go wrong. So think about it. If the balloon flies away and doesn't take the string with it, that's the whole mission gone. So you definitely need to have some contingency plan for that, whether it's a spare or something. If one payload doesn't get turned on, boy, that's a shame. And, that could be a real key part of the mission too, particularly if it's the sensor that's taking key part of the data. So, you have to have a contingency or a plan to mitigate that too. And that oftentimes involves training the people and checking right before you launch, is this on, is this on? And maybe, have you seen those remove before flight or install before flight tags, the real brightly colored ones? A lot of times it comes down to having something like that on there, or a bright pink piece of tape or something that somebody checks and then they take it off once it's checked so that they know that things are ready to go. And so overall, to summarize, think about each piece of the payload string and the balloon and the people, that are involved in the operations that day. Think about what can go wrong. Somebody could wake up that morning really sick and they can't do their job. So to mitigate that, you have to have other people who've practiced that job in advance. And then think about how critical that is and how likely it is. And then think about what plan B would be, and be ready. Because if you have if a tool breaks or the regulator breaks, actually we've had that happen on the field too. The regulator broke, and so, you have to have a spare regulator so that you can get back to doing what you're supposed to be doing.
I'm Eric Kelsey, and I'm a research associate professor in meteorology at Plymouth State University. Things that could go wrong. I think a good approach is is always to look at what components can fail, or imagining that all components might fail, and thinking about what you would do in the case that any one of those components might fail. So what if a GSU fails? What if a radiosonde fails? What if a balloon pops? What if there's a leak in your tubing from the helium tank to the balloon? What sort of materials or spare parts or duplicate pieces of equipment do you need in order to um, to mitigate the challenge that occurs? Um, as long as funds can, as long as you have the funds available, it's always good to have duplicates of things, maybe a duplicate cable. Um, Certainly, spare balloons are always good. Some extra helium in case a balloon pops. Extra radiosondes are always good. Um, and then there's those other items like tubing going from the helium tank to the balloon itself. What if that springs a leak? Will duct tape be good? Having duct tape on hand is always a good idea. Just going through with your team what you would do if any and every component breaks is a great exercise to go through. As a team leader, it's an interesting and enlightening exercise to have your team go through a practice launch and either remove a piece of equipment or put in a damaged piece of equipment, and not tell the team about it and see how they respond, right? And see if they can figure out how to remedy the problem in real time and in time to launch the balloon at the designated time that they need to launch it.
All right, well, let me start by introducing myself. My name's Mary Bowden. I'm faculty at the University of Maryland in College Park, and I have been launching balloons for almost 20 years now. So we're at our 115th flight. And I will tell you that there are so many things that can go wrong, but often things that you can handle and you get better and better at as you go along. Probably the most common problem on a launch is that you get to the launch site and you realize that you forgot something essential. For example, we have forgotten the balloon. That's a problem. We we have forgotten the parachute. That's a problem. And so there are certainly essential things like that that are where you absolutely have to find a way to get it to your launch site and hopefully still continue on with your launch. Some teams, of course, are far more able to launch close to where all of their equipment is stored, so maybe it's less of a problem. But we usually have to drive a good hour and a half or 2 hours in order to find a location where we can launch. But it's not just things that are obvious like that. It's also, maybe a particular cable that you might need to upload some software, or maybe a specific battery or something like that. And so here's my advice for how to take care of this: is you have to have a checklist or multiple checklists, many checklists. And then most important, you have to remember to check the checklist before you leave. And so that is probably, it's not a tremendously serious problem generally because it's very fixable, but it is something that has occurred on so many of our launches. And so we've discovered that checklists for every payload and checklists for just the whole launch operation are essential to run the whole operation. But can I add, there are a few other things that occur surprisingly, or when you don't expect them. Just for example, getting to the launch site and discovering that one of your helium tanks is actually empty when you thought it was full. And this can happen if maybe whoever checked the helium tank for pressure didn't close the valve all the way, and so it leaked very slowly and all your helium's gone. Or sometimes we have gotten a helium tank delivered with no helium in it. So it happens. It's well worth checking ahead of time. And I think the real takeaway is to always bring extra helium if you can, there's a second reason for that, because another problem we've run into a few times is that either during the inflation operation or at some point, the balloon bursts, or somebody or somehow it gets released when it wasn't quite ready to go and the payloads weren't tied on. And so if you lose a balloon during an inflation operation, it's very important to have a backup balloon. So the takeaway from those little issues are you should always bring an extra balloon, and you should always bring extra helium if you can. Helium's in great, see, we don't always have enough, but if you can bring extra helium, that's great.
Yeah, so the biggest thing that we have go wrong on launch day is something gets forgotten. We launch pretty far from the university. It's anywhere from 1 to a 2 hour drive. So once we're at the launch location, if we've forgotten a battery or a cable, it's kind of a big deal. So that's the big thing, is just really having good checklists, making sure that someone is in charge of making sure that everything that needs to go goes. So that's a big one. When we leave the airport to go on recovery, we're almost instantly out of cell phone coverage. So staying connected with the group and having a plan. If we're in multiple cars and we get separated or lost, to have kind of like a rally point where we can meet back up, preferably somewhere where there's some cell reception. We do carry handheld radios as well too, and that becomes the primary means of communication once we're out in the field. So that's one thing. Just accidents, I mean, we've had people just slip and fall in the parking lot and end up needing to visit an emergency room. So everyone on the team is first aid trained, first aid CPR. We make that a requirement for all the interns. And then we have first aid kits that we take with us. We're a little unique here in Montana. I mean, we have grizzly bears, so bear and black bears, so bear sprays, something that we have to have with us. We have rattlesnakes in a lot of the places that we're recovering. So making sure that everyone is aware of the hazards before we go out into the field to do launches and recoveries. And then just weather is the last one. You show up at the airport and it's raining. It's still going to be raining at launch time. So for us, generally, we'll push on if the weather's not great, if we think it's going to clear, right? But just kind of having those contingencies in mind.
You talked about a bunch of contingencies that dealt with people. Of course, those are important, but I think of contingencies more as the stuff that is to fly. And you're right, forgetting things, this is a bad thing. Sometimes you have to try to repair things on the spot. We do carry stuff for that and do it more often than I would like to admit. On the other hand, sometimes it's not really anybody's fault. It's like, look, that was just a bad balloon. It does happen. And so I would say the primary thing to take with you on every flight is more balloons than you're going to fly and more helium than you're going to use. So that you don't have to say, look, we inflated the balloon and we lost it. It slipped off, it popped, whatever. Something bad happened. It's not common, but if it happens, I don't want to have to scrub. I want to be able to restart on the same day without having to go back to my lab, because like you, we're often hours drive away from the lab. So I would say bring extra stuff, as much as you can. It's not always practical, but bring extra gas, bring extra balloons, bring extra batteries as you are able.
I'll go to the other extreme. So on the sort of like if you're going to go camping, it makes sense maybe to camp in the backyard first and see what you might forget. We like to do that with our new interns. Is maybe a week before the flight, we'll try to do a mock flight on campus where we do everything except launch the balloon, and try to keep track of, like, if you have to keep running inside to grab something, you don't have that option on a flight day. So letting the students figure out all the stuff that they need in the launch kit. Do you need tape? Do you need screwdrivers? What type of screwdriver? And just making sure all those pieces are there. So we'll do a full dress rehearsal, sometimes even going as far as putting some helium into a small balloon, just so they get as realistic as they can before you go out into the field and do it for real.
So well in advance, then have everyone sit down, and it really takes a diverse group to do this. Have everyone sit down and just be negative about the day and think through and list every single thing that can go wrong. It doesn't matter how wild it is, bird fly into the balloon. It doesn't matter how crazy it is, but just make a long list. It could be 60 things, that could go wrong. And then as you go through the list, say, how likely is it? Birds are pretty good. Maybe it won't fly into the balloon, not very likely, or real likely, that the balloon might have a manufactured hole in it. It's more likely, maybe not real likely. And just go ahead and go through, how likely things are and then what the consequence would be. And anything that's a high consequence after that, then just spend some time figuring out what you're going to do, to make sure that that doesn't happen. Have spare helium so you don't run out. Have a spare regulator so if it jams, or something happens that day, you can accommodate that, by having a spare, or, of course, everybody has their box of duct tape, rope, there are all kinds of things, that people have to help them on the day of an operation, and having that box is important, and having practices and the tools listed and available in a specific tool place is really a key too. So every single practice you do, if you identify you need something during the practice, then make sure that thing is in the special tool place. And if it's a really important tool, make sure you have a spare. So systems, complex systems like this have hardware, and that includes the balloon and all the payloads that we've talked about. They have software, so there's definitely programmed pieces of all of this, and how the communications happens between the ground station and the balloon, and any other places that communication happens. And then there are the people. And I think that one of the most overlooked aspects is the people. And it's so important to have the people as prepared as everything else and as tested as everything else through rehearsals that can start off really simple and end up like a complete dress rehearsal, and a launch. Sometime before the actual day so that you have enough time to mitigate anything that might have gone wrong.
I agree with the suggestions other people have given for contingency planning. Let me just throw in a couple more things. Not only checklists to look at stuff before you go out, but it's really important to return stuff at the end of a day. So for instance, we have a launch tote. And one of the key things to get back into the launch tote is the scale we use to measure lift. Because if that's missing, we can't fly because we can't tell how much lift we have, and we need to know that to set up our flights correctly. We have our recovery tote. Make sure the things that were taken out of the recovery tote go back into the recovery tote at the end of the day. And we have what we call our extras tote. So the extras tote has extra batteries and extra cables and soldering irons. But if you have a soldering iron and no solder, that doesn't help. So that brings me to a related comment. If you finish something up, you take out the zip ties and you finish them, make sure somebody knows to replenish the zip ties before you go out and fly again, or replenish the solder, or replenish the electrical tape, or whatever. Weather. There have been some comments about weather. You don't have much control over the weather, but you certainly should be monitoring the weather. And of course, make sure that your participants are prepared for whatever conditions you're going to be in, whether it's going to be cold or wet or hot. In the case of cold, make sure you are aware of hypothermia and the signs of hypothermia. Make sure people are appropriately dressed for the cold, and perhaps have hand warmers and things like that to help people stay warm. In the case of heat, make sure you are aware of heat stroke and conditions under which you could get too hot and what it looks like, and make sure people have plenty of water and stuff like that to keep themselves hydrated. Lightning is an issue, of course, and so the CDC has recommendations for like stadiums and stuff, and that is if there is lightning or thunder. So if you can hear thunder, even if you can't see the lightning, that means there's lightning somewhere. You're supposed to take cover, and you're supposed to stay in cover. And in our case, that might be within our vehicles until 30 minutes after this has dissipated until you don't hear any more thunder or see any more lightning, even in the distance. That can be very frustrating if you're trying to get a balloon up. And if it's windy, you might have to abandon an inflation, for instance, because you can't leave people out to control the balloon before you have a chance to actually release it. A final comment about just general severe conditions, and that is, at this time of year, right now it's April, there's flooding going on in many parts of the country. There's severe weather. There's going to be severe weather at certain places along the eclipse line, no matter what. So some people, hopefully not me, but some people are likely to struggle to get their balloon missions up because of severe weather. On the other hand, if you can predict where the severe weather will be, and if you're flexible enough to move, it's like drive north to get away from that storm that's coming, or drive south to get out of the flood zone, or certainly don't enter a place that's been recently damaged by tornadoes or whatever. They have other issues. They don't want to be dealing with you. So as you're able, be flexible about where you fly, and try not to fly in places that people are not going to be welcoming because they're struggling with recent severe issues like floods or like tornadoes or things like that.